The words hit Nelson Yates like a branding iron pressed flat against his chest. Julia Ford stood in the dying copper light of a New Mexico evening, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her jaw set in that particular way he had come to recognize as the wall going up between them. Behind her, the Yates homestead stretched out across 40 acres of hard-won grassland, the windmill turning slow in the September breeze of 1882, the barn red and solid and real. And she was telling him to surrender it, to walk away, to let the Calloway Land Company take every inch of it without a fight. "It is not worth dying for, Nelson," she said, her voice low but shaking at the edges, the way a fence post shakes when the earth beneath it has grown unstable. "A piece of land is not worth your life. It is not worth mine. I am asking you to let it go." He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of long moment that contains everything two people have ever been to each other, every early morning, every shared meal, every argument and every silence, and every time one of them reached across the dark for the other. "I am not fighting for the land," he said. She blinked. The wall cracked just slightly. "Then what are you fighting for?" He took one step toward her, and the whole weight of the past year came with him. The hidden motives behind the Calloway Company's sudden interest in this particular stretch of land. The dark past that Julia carried like a stone in her chest, the secret she had not yet told him, the one he had been slowly, carefully, terrifyingly close to discovering. The betrayal that had set all of this in motion long before either of them had ever spoken a single word to each other. "I am fighting for you," he said. "I have been fighting for you since the moment you stepped off that stagecoach." And that was when Julia Ford did something that Nelson Yates had never seen her do in 11 months of knowing her. She began to cry. Not the kind of crying that comes from sadness alone. The kind that comes when something you have been holding rigid inside yourself for so long finally gives way, and the relief and the grief and the love all rush out at once, indistinguishable from each other. It had not started here, in the last light of a September evening with the windmill turning and the grassland breathing around them. It had started almost a year ago, in the dust and noise of Santa Rosa, New Mexico, on a cold October morning when the stagecoach from Albuquerque rolled to a stop in front of the Carmichael Hotel, and a woman stepped down with a single leather traveling bag and eyes that had already seen too much of the world's hardness. The October of 1881 in Santa Rosa was a season of dry wind and unease. The town had grown fast, the way frontier towns did, from a collection of adobe buildings and a trading post into something with a main street and a bank and 3 saloons, and a weekly newspaper that printed more rumor than truth. The railroad had come through 2 years prior, which brought money and strangers, and the particular kind of ambition that tends to make honest men nervous. Nelson Yates had been in Santa Rosa for 4 years by then. He had come from Kansas, from a cattle town called Dodge, where he had spent 3 years working other men's cattle and living in a bunkhouse that leaked in the rain, saving every dollar he could press flat and keep. He was 27 years old when he bought his 40 acres southeast of Santa Rosa, old enough to have lost his illusions about easy fortune, young enough to still believe in the possibility of a life built by his own hands. He was not a large man in the way that frontier legends suggested men ought to be. He was lean and weathered and quiet, with dark eyes that paid close attention and hands that were always doing something, mending a fence or sharpening a blade, or rolling the brim of his hat between his fingers when he was thinking. He had a reputation in town for being fair, for paying what he owed on time, for never losing his temper in public, which in Santa Rosa in 1881 was considered a virtue so rare it was almost suspicious. He had placed the advertisement in the Albuquerque Daily Journal in August of that year, not because he was lonely, though he was, but because the ranch required more than one person to run properly, and he understood the mathematics of frontier survival clearly enough to admit it. The advertisement had been plain and honest in the way he tried to be plain and honest about everything. Rancher, 4 years established, 40 acres, good water, seeks capable woman for marriage and partnership. Age between 20 and 35. Willingness to work required. Letter to Box 14, Santa Rosa, New Mexico Territory. He had received 7 responses. He had written back to 3. He had reached an understanding with 1. Her name, she had written in a clean and careful hand, was Julia Ford. She was 24 years old. She was from St. Louis originally, but had spent the past 2 years in Albuquerque working as a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant. She had no family of note remaining. She could ride, cook, manage accounts, and was not afraid of hard work or difficult weather. She did not pretend to any romantic notions about frontier life and asked that he not pretend to any romantic notions about her. She was practical. She was available. She would like to see the land before agreeing to anything permanent. He had found her letter refreshing in a way that unsettled him slightly. Most of the other letters had been either desperate or falsely cheerful. Hers read like a business proposal written by someone who had been burned before and was determined not to be burned again. He had written back and told her he appreciated directness. He said the land was good land. He said he would meet her at the stagecoach on the 15th of October if she decided to come. She came. He saw her before she saw him, which gave him the advantage of a first impression unobserved. She was of medium height with dark brown hair pulled back under a traveling bonnet that had seen better days, wearing a practical gray dress that had been mended at the left sleeve. She moved with a deliberate economy, nothing wasted, the way someone moves when they are accustomed to carrying their own weight. Her face was serious and clear-eyed, neither beautiful in the soft way of portrait paintings nor plain in the way that men dismissed. She was striking in a way that had more to do with the intelligence behind her eyes than the arrangement of her features. She looked around the dusty main street of Santa Rosa with an expression that was not disappointment exactly, but was a careful accounting of what she was seeing, measuring it against whatever she had imagined. He stepped forward and removed his hat. "Miss Ford, I am Nelson Yates." She looked at him with the same accounting expression she had turned on the street. "Mr. Yates," she said, "the advertisement said good water. How good?" He almost smiled. "Deep well, reliable. Never went dry even in the summer of '79, which was the driest the territory had seen in 20 years. And the 40 acres, what portion is workable?" 32. "The rest is scrubland on the north edge, but it serves as natural fence and windbreak." She nodded slowly. "All right, I would like to see it." He had arranged for a buggy. They rode out of Santa Rosa in the late morning, southeast along the wagon road, with the Pecos River glinting bronze in the distance, and the grassland spread out wide and gold in the autumn sun. He pointed out the landmarks as they went, the stand of cottonwoods that marked the boundary of his property, the ridge line to the east that kept the worst of the winter wind off the buildings, the dark shape of the barn visible from half a mile out. She asked questions the whole way. Not the questions of someone performing interest, but real questions with follow-up questions about soil quality and water rights, and the relationship with neighboring landowners, and what the winters were like, and how far to the nearest doctor. He answered each one honestly, including the ones with complicated answers. By the time they reached the homestead itself, something had shifted between them in the subtle way that two careful people begin to recognize in each other a kindred carefulness. She stood in the yard and looked at the house, which was solid adobe with a covered porch and 2 rooms added on from the original single room, and she looked at the barn, and she looked at the windmill and the well and the kitchen garden that had gone dry for winter, and then she turned and looked at him. "You built all of this yourself?" she asked. "The original room was standing when I bought the property. Everything else, yes." "In 4 years?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, and he had the impression she was revising something about her estimation of him. "The bookkeeping you mentioned in your letter," she said. "Your accounts, are they current? Within the week? May I see them?" He brought her inside and showed her the ledger he kept on the shelf beside the fireplace, and she sat down at the table and read through 3 years of accounts with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what they were reading. He built up the fire and made coffee and let her work. After 20 minutes she closed the ledger and looked up. "You are solvent. More than solvent, actually. You manage money carefully." "I grew up without enough of it," he said. "It teaches you respect." Something moved through her expression at that, quick and complicated, like a shadow crossing water. "Yes," she said quietly, "it does." They had dinner, which he cooked badly and she ate without complaint, and they talked about the arrangement. He was clear about what he expected and what he could offer. She was clear about her own expectations in return. They shook hands that evening like two people entering a business agreement, which in the frontier world of 1881 was not unusual and was, in certain ways, more honest than the alternative. The wedding was performed 2 weeks later by the circuit preacher, who came through Santa Rosa on the last Friday of October. It was witnessed by his neighbor, a farmer named Brant Hollies, and the woman who ran the general store, Edna Carmichael, who cried a little and pressed a jar of her preserved peaches into Julia's hands afterward as though it were a sacred offering. The first weeks of the marriage were polite and careful in the way of two people occupying shared space before trust has been established. Nelson gave Julia the larger bedroom and slept in the smaller one, an arrangement they had agreed upon in advance. She took over the bookkeeping and the kitchen garden preparation for spring, and within a week had reorganized the pantry and the supply ledger in a way that made the household materially more efficient. He felt this as a kind of eloquent language she was speaking, her competence, her order, her quiet investment in the place as though she were choosing it, not just enduring it. She cooked well. It turned out far better than he did. And she was easy company in the evenings, sitting by the fire with a book or with mending, not needing to fill every silence with words the way some people did. He found this deeply restful. He had not known until then how much of his solitude had been loneliness wearing a more acceptable mask. The trouble with the Calloway Land Company arrived in November, the way trouble in the frontier West often arrived, wearing the clothing of legitimate business. A man named Gerald Spicer rode out to the Yates homestead on a Tuesday morning in the third week of November. A well-dressed man in his 40s with soft hands, and the particular kind of confident smile that belongs to people who are accustomed to being given what they want. He introduced himself as a representative of the Calloway Land Company out of Denver, Colorado, and presented Nelson with a printed letter offering to purchase the Yates property at what he described as a very fair market price. Nelson read the letter on the porch while Spicer waited on horseback. "The land is not for sale," Nelson said. Spicer smiled in the way that meant he had expected this and had prepared for it. "Mr. Yates, the company is prepared to be generous." The figure in that letter represents nearly twice the assessed value of the property. "I would encourage you to consider carefully before. The land is not for sale," Nelson said again. Spicer's smile did not disappear exactly. It just adjusted, became less warm and more fixed like a painted thing. "We will be in touch," he said, and rode back toward Santa Rosa. Nelson brought the letter inside and set it on the table. Julia read it standing up, not sitting, the way people read things they are prepared to reject immediately. When she finished, she set it down and looked at him with an expression he could not entirely read. "They are offering twice the market value," she said. "I heard what he said. That is not normal." "No," he agreed. "It is not." She picked the letter up again and reread it more slowly, and he watched her face do something complicated. "Nelson," she said carefully, "do you know what the Calloway Land Company actually does with the land it acquires?" "Consolidates it, I assume. Ranching operations, same as any large land company." She shook her head slightly. "The railroad," she said. "There are surveys happening. I heard about it in town last week when I was at the supply house. The Territorial Surveyor's Office has been active in this area. If a rail line is planned through this particular corridor," she tapped the letter, "this land would become worth 4 or 5 times this offer overnight." He looked at her steadily. "How do you know about railroad surveys?" A pause, just a fraction of a second too long. "I worked for 2 years as a bookkeeper," she said. Dry goods merchants hear everything. I paid attention. It was true enough to satisfy him in the moment. He would think about it later, in the middle of the night when sleep came slowly, that her answer had been true and also had been a door carefully closed rather than a door opened. Through November and into December, the Calloway Company's pressure grew by incremental degrees. Gerald Spicer came back twice more with revised offers, each one higher than the last, and each time Nelson turned him away from the porch with the same flat refusal. Letters arrived at the post office in town. Then there was an incident with the north fence, which was found cut in 3 places on a Tuesday morning, letting 6 head of cattle wander onto the scrubland. Then a supply order Nelson had placed at the general store was mysteriously lost, leaving them short of winter provisions until he could ride to the next town. None of these were things he could prove. All of them had the particular texture of deliberate harassment. Julia watched all of it and said very little, but he could feel her carrying a weight that had nothing to do with the practical difficulties they were managing. She slept badly. He could hear her sometimes in the other room, the restlessness of someone whose mind would not quiet. She threw herself into work with an intensity that bordered on relentlessness, always moving, always productive, as though stillness were something she was afraid of. December brought the first real cold, and with it a kind of enforced closeness as the shorter days and longer nights kept them both inside more. They played cards sometimes after supper, a simple game with a worn deck he had owned since Kansas. She was a sharper player than he was, quick to calculate odds and remember what had been played, and she won often and graciously, which was its own kind of information about her character. One evening in the second week of December, he was reading by the fire and looked up to find her watching him with an expression that vanished the moment his eyes met hers, replaced by her book. "What is it?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "You were thinking something." She was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking that you are a better man than I expected you to be," she said finally, in the tone of someone delivering a verdict after long deliberation. He did not know what to do with that, so he said, "I was not aware I was being evaluated." "We are always being evaluated," she said. "The wise ones know it." He went back to his book, but he was not reading. He was sitting with the warmth of what she had said and the slight sadness in the way she had said it, as though being a better man than expected was also, for her, a complication. Christmas of 1881 was quiet. His neighbor Brant Hollies and Brant's wife Meredith came to supper, and Julia cooked a meal that was genuinely impressive considering what the territory's winters offered in terms of provisions. And they sat around the table for 3 hours, and talked and laughed, and Nelson watched Julia being easy and warm with the Hollises, and felt something shift further in his chest toward her. Meredith Hollies pulled him aside in the kitchen, while Julia was telling Brant about a horse she had gentled that week, a difficult animal that had been causing problems since purchase. "She is good for you," Meredith said quietly, with the blunt certainty that frontier women of a certain age developed about people. "We manage well together," he said. Meredith gave him the look that those same women gave to men who were being deliberately obtuse. "That is not what I said," she told him, and went back to the table. January was brutal. 2 blizzards inside 1 week, which was unusual even for New Mexico winters at that elevation, and they were snowed in for 5 days the first time and 3 days the second. The horses needed tending 3 times daily, and the cattle needed feed brought out through heavy snow, and the wood supply needed constant maintenance, and there was no time or energy for anything except the work of keeping things alive. In the middle of the second blizzard, on the third night when the wind was so loud it was nearly impossible to sleep, he heard her get up, and he got up too, and found her standing at the kitchen window, watching the white dark outside with her arms wrapped around herself. "It will break tomorrow," he said. "The sky showed it this afternoon. The pressure is changing." She did not turn around. "Nelson," she said, and something in the way she said his name, just his name, nothing else, made his heart do a slow, hard thing in his chest. "Yes," he said, "I need to tell you something." "All right." She turned then, and her face in the low lamplight was stripped down to something essential. The careful social competence she wore like a second skin was simply gone, and what was underneath was a woman in genuine distress. "Not tonight," she said, which was the opposite of what he expected. "Not yet. But I need to tell you something. And I need you to know that when I do, I want you to hear all of it before you." She stopped. "Before I what?" She shook her head. "Before you make any judgments." "Julia," he said, and took one careful step toward her. "Whatever it is, not tonight," she said again firmly. And something in her firmness told him that she was right, that she needed to be the one to choose the time, and that pushing her now would close the door rather than open it. So he nodded, and they stood together at the window in the howling dark and watched the snow until the cold drove them back to their separate rooms. February arrived like an apology after the January storms, mild and clear and bright with reflected snowlight. And with it came a new development from the Calloway Company that changed the nature of the pressure entirely. Nelson came home from town on a Thursday afternoon to find a stranger on his porch, a man he did not recognize, lean and weathered with a deputy's badge pinned to his coat. The stranger introduced himself as Deputy Clark Weber, out of the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe. He had papers. He told Nelson, with the practiced sympathy of someone delivering bad news they have delivered many times, that the Calloway Land Company had filed a formal land dispute against the Yates property, claiming that the original 1877 deed of sale through which Nelson had purchased the land from one Thomas Hallett was fraudulent, that Hallett had not had clear title to sell at the time of sale, and that the true ownership of the 40 acres was therefore in question pending a territorial court review. Nelson stood on his own porch and read the papers and felt something go cold and carefully controlled in his center. "How long does a review take?" he asked. "Anywhere from 3 months to a year," Deputy Weber said, not without sympathy. "I am sorry, Mr. Yates. You will want to retain legal counsel in Santa Fe." When Weber rode away, Nelson stood in the yard for a long time looking at the deed papers he had pulled from the house, the original purchase documents from 1877, the survey records, the paid receipts. Everything looked solid. He had been careful. He had paid a lawyer in Albuquerque to review the documents before he signed. Thomas Hallett had been a legitimate seller as far as anyone could determine. But he also knew, standing there in the February cold with the papers in his hand, that a big enough company with good enough lawyers could challenge a legitimate title long enough and expensively enough to break a smaller landowner through sheer financial attrition alone. That was what this was. Not a real legal dispute. A trap. A slow, expensive, deliberately complicated trap. Julia came out onto the porch and read the papers without a word, and then looked up at him with her clear dark eyes. "This is the railroad," she said quietly. "This is why they want this specific land. Not just your 40 acres, Nelson. There must be a dozen properties along this corridor that they are targeting. Yours is just one of the easier ones to challenge because of the Hallett deed." "How do you know about Hallett?" She met his eyes. "You told me, when you were showing me the property documents in the first week." He thought back and could not clearly remember saying Hallett's name, but he might have. There was a lot from those early weeks that had run together in his memory. "We need a lawyer," he said. "Yes," she said. "But we also need to understand who at the Territorial Land Office is working with the Calloway Company. Because that badge that man was wearing may have been completely legitimate, and it may have been borrowed clothes. Either way, someone is manipulating the official process from the inside." He looked at her. "That is a serious thing to say about a federal deputy." "Yes," she said. "It is. I know." And she said it in the tone of someone who has learned from personal experience exactly how corrupt official channels can become when large amounts of money are involved. That was the first crack. That was the place where the hidden thing she had not yet told him became impossible to ignore entirely, where the outline of a secret became clear even before the secret itself was revealed. But he waited. He was a patient man. He had built 40 acres out of raw land through patience. He could wait. March brought a lawyer from Santa Fe named Edward Quill, a small dry man of 50 with a mind like a steel trap who charged reasonable rates and had a reputation for winning land cases. Quill reviewed the Yates documents and confirmed what Nelson had already suspected. The deed was clean. Whatever flaw the Calloway Company claimed to have found, it was manufactured. But manufactured flaws, Quill explained patiently, still required time and money to disprove in court, and the court calendar in Santa Fe was backed up by nearly 8 months. So they would have to wait, and pay, and keep the pressure of the Calloway Company at a distance while they did. It was during the waiting, the long, careful spring of 1882, that the distance between the 2 rooms at the Yates homestead began to collapse in ways that had nothing to do with the land dispute. It happened the way real things happen between real people, not in one dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of smaller ones. It happened in the mornings when she brought coffee out to where he was working on the north fence and stayed to help without being asked. It happened in the evenings when they sat close to the fire with the account books between them and their heads bent together over numbers, and their shoulders nearly touching and neither of them moving away. It happened when she laughed, a real laugh, not the polite social variety, the one that came out of her sometimes unexpectedly when something struck her as genuinely funny, and the sound of it was so full and unguarded that he felt it the way you feel sudden sunshine. He had been careful. He had promised himself to be careful, to not mistake proximity for affection or shared hardship for love. He was practical enough to understand that their arrangement had been built on practical foundations, and he did not want to complicate it with feelings she had not asked for or invited. But he was losing that particular battle by degrees. In April, the Calloway Company's tactics became physical in a way that crossed a line. He was coming back from the western pasture on a Thursday evening when he found Spicer's man, a heavy-shouldered hired hand named Goss, standing in the yard near the barn. Julia was on the porch, and the way she was standing told him everything before he was close enough to hear what was being said. She was not afraid. She was furious, and she was controlling it with a precision that was more alarming than fear would have been. Goss was saying something in a low voice that Nelson could not hear. Julia was saying nothing, just watching Goss with those clear dark eyes that missed nothing. Nelson came into the yard at a pace that was not quite a run but was nothing like a casual approach. Goss turned and looked at him without apparent concern, a man accustomed to being able to end conversations through physical intimidation alone. "Yates," he said, "Spicer wanted me to make sure you understood the offer on the table won't stay there forever." "You have a message," Nelson said. "You can deliver it to me, not to my wife. You can get off my property now." "Your property," Goss said, with heavy emphasis on the first word. "My property. Get off it." Goss looked from him to Julia and back, then smiled in the way that meant he was not finished and would be back, and he rode out. Nelson turned to Julia. She was gripping the porch railing with both hands, her knuckles white. "What did he say to you?" Nelson asked. "He said it would be safer for us both if we took the offer," she said. Her voice was level, but her eyes were not. "Are you all right?" "I am fine." Then after a beat, "Nelson, he knew my name." Nelson went still. "What?" he said. "Mrs. Yates, give your husband this message. He knew my name." "We are not unknown in town. People know he said my name," she said quietly. "Julia Ford Yates. Both names. The way people say a full name when they want you to know they have been looking." He looked at her and she looked at him, and the space between them was full of the things she still had not told him, pressing against both of them like a third presence. "Julia," he said quietly. "Not yet," she said. The same thing she had said in the blizzard. But this time there was something different in it, not a refusal but a request for a little more time, a last bit of gathering before the threshold. That night he could not sleep. He lay in his room listening to the darkness of the house and thought about the accumulated evidence of her, the knowledge she had about railroad surveys, The way she understood corporate land acquisition tactics with a precision that exceeded what a bookkeeper in a dry goods store would need. The careful closing of doors in conversation. The moment in the blizzard when she had almost told him. The fear in her face when Goss said her full name. She was not simply a woman from St. Louis who had worked in Albuquerque and answered an advertisement. That was all true, but it was not all of her. He waited. She told him on a Friday evening in the second week of May, when the grassland was green from spring rains, and the kitchen garden was full of new growth, and the day had been quiet enough for a truth to finally find space to live in. She came to the table after supper instead of clearing the dishes, which told him she was ready, and she sat down and folded her hands on the table in front of her with the careful posture of someone bracing themselves, and he sat down across from her and waited. "My name before I married you," she said, "was Julia Ford. That is true. But before I was a bookkeeper in Albuquerque, I was something else." She looked at her hands. "I worked for 18 months as a records clerk for the Western Territorial Survey Commission in Santa Fe. I was 22 years old, and it was the best position I had ever obtained, and I was very good at it." He waited. "The commission is supposed to be an independent government body," she said. "It is supposed to assess land and resource surveys for the territorial government, not for private interests. But by the time I was there, half of the commission's upper staff were on retainer quietly to the Calloway Land Company. They were flagging profitable land corridors, specifically the ones where railroad expansion was projected, and feeding that information privately to Calloway before the public survey results were released. Calloway would begin acquisition proceedings on targeted properties before any of the landowners knew the land had become valuable. "That is fraud," Nelson said quietly. "It's the Federal Land Administration." "Yes," she said, "and I found out about it not on purpose. I found discrepancies in the survey records, double filing on certain property assessments, correspondence that should not have existed. I was a very good records clerk. It was my job to notice things." She paused. "I brought it to my direct supervisor. His name was Harlan Creek. He told me I had misunderstood the documents and I should let it go. But you did not let it go." "I made copies," she said, "of everything. All the correspondence, all the falsified survey records, all the commission payments. I kept them." Nelson looked at her steadily and felt the whole shape of it becoming clear. "The Calloway Company knows you have them." "They did not when I left Santa Fe," she said. "I was careful. I left quietly, gave no reason for suspicion, went to Albuquerque and took the bookkeeping position and tried to decide what to do with what I had. Who to trust. Whether the corruption went high enough that bringing it to federal authorities would simply result in the evidence disappearing and me disappearing along with it." She finally looked up and met his eyes. "I answered your advertisement because I needed to be somewhere quiet and legitimate and off the known road. I am sorry, Nelson. I was not entirely honest with you about all of my reasons." The word betrayal did not feel right to him, and he examined that carefully. She had deceived him by omission. She had used the practical safety of the arrangement as cover. These were facts. But he also knew, sitting across from her in the lamplight with the spring dark outside the windows, that she had worked harder and more honestly and more faithfully on this homestead than he had had any right to expect, and that whatever her original reasons for coming, she had stayed for reasons that were real. "The documents," he said. "Where are they?" "Hidden," she said. "Safe, not here." "Does the Calloway Company know where you are?" "I believe Goss figuring out my full name means yes," she said. "I think they have found me. I think they have been watching my movements and connected me to this property and to you, and the land dispute is their method of driving you out and isolating us so they can pressure me without witnesses." He sat with this for a long time. The fire crackled. Outside, the night insects sang. "What do you need?" he said. She blinked. "I told you I used you. I told you I put you at risk by being here. I told you that the reason the Calloway Company is targeting your homestead with particular aggression might be connected to me. And you ask me what I need. You had your reasons," he said. "Some of them may not have been the ones you told me, but you came, you stayed. You have worked this land and kept these books and been a true partner in every way that matters, and you are in danger." He looked at her across the table, that same steady look that was, she would realize later, the truest thing about him. "So yes, I'm asking what you need." She looked at him for a long time. Then something in her face shifted, moved away from the bracing and toward something warmer and more frightened at once. "I do not know," she said honestly. "I have been carrying this alone for so long that I have forgotten how to think about it with another person." "Then let us figure it out together," he said. They sat at the table for 3 more hours that night, talking through what she had, what it meant, and what to do with it. She described the documents in detail, the specific commissioners named in the correspondence, the dates, the property codes, the payment amounts. She drew from memory a map of the survey corridor that the documents indicated as the planned railroad route, and he looked at it and saw that his 40 acres sat in almost exactly the center of it. "No wonder they want this specific land so badly," he said. "They need the whole corridor," she said. "They cannot build around isolated holdouts. If even 2 or 3 landowners refuse to sell, the whole route becomes unworkable and they lose the exclusive rail contract they have been building toward. Then there are other landowners along this corridor who are being targeted. Yes, almost certainly." He looked at the map. "If we could reach them, and if we could get the documents to the right federal authority before the Calloway Company can suppress them. We stop this," he said. "Possibly," she said. "Or we make ourselves a target significant enough that they decide to stop being subtle about it." "They sent a man to threaten you in my yard," he said. "That is already not subtle," she nodded slowly. "No, it is not." They looked at each other across the table and something settled between them, a shared direction, a jointly claimed problem, the particular intimacy of 2 people who have decided to face the same danger together. He realized he was not afraid. He was, impossibly, the opposite of afraid. There was a clarity to this that felt clean and true. "We should sleep," he said finally. "We need clear heads tomorrow." She stood and collected the coffee cups and carried them to the basin, and he watched her back, the set of her shoulders, slightly less rigid than they had been an hour ago, and felt something come loose in his chest with a warmth that was not entirely separate from pain. "Julia," he said. She turned. "Thank you for telling me." She held his eyes for a moment. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not walking away." In the weeks that followed, they worked with a focused urgency that made the ordinary labor of the ranch feel almost light by comparison, because now there was something larger they were working toward. Nelson rode the survey corridor over the course of 3 separate days, following the line Julia had drawn from memory and matching it to the land he knew, and he identified 7 other homesteaders whose properties fell along the route. He knew 3 of them reasonably well from town. Tom Aldridge, who ran a small cattle operation 2 miles west, a widow named Cecilia Moss who had 300 acres of good grazing land, and a mixed-race family called the Beauchamps who had built a market garden on 20 acres near the river and were extraordinarily good at it. He began visiting them quietly, riding out in the evenings, not wanting to bring attention to a pattern of meetings that the Calloway Company might interpret as organizing. He brought facts and not conjecture, and he listened to what each of them had experienced over the past year, the unsolicited offers, the mysterious complications, the pressure. Every single one of them had a story. Every single one of them recognized what he was describing. And every single one of them was afraid in the way that people are afraid when they feel alone against something bigger than themselves. He brought Julia with him to the meeting with Cecilia Moss, because Cecilia was sharp and skeptical, and he thought Julia's clear-headed command of the facts would be more persuasive than his own. He was right. Cecilia listened to Julia describe the survey documents and the commission fraud with her head slightly tilted and her eyes narrowed. And at the end of it she said, "All right, I am in. What do we do?" June arrived, and the pressure from the Calloway Company shifted again. There were now lawyers formally involved on both sides, Quill working the title challenge in Santa Fe, and a Calloway attorney named Foster who was talented and expensive. But Quill was communicating something encouraging. The title challenge was thinner than Calloway had hoped, because Nelson's original deed from Hallett was airtight, and the manufactured flaw they were pointing to was transparently constructed. The real danger, Quill wrote in a letter, was not the title challenge succeeding. The real danger was the prolonged expense of defending it while Calloway simultaneously acquired the surrounding properties and left the Yates homestead isolated. Julia had been managing the household accounts with her usual precision, and she came to Nelson one evening with the ledger open and said, "We have enough to keep Quill engaged for perhaps 4 more months before the legal costs begin to genuinely threaten the ranch." He looked at the numbers. 4 months, he said. "So we need to move faster," she said. "The documents. We need to get them to the right authority, and we need to do it before the Calloway Company decides that legal maneuvering is too slow and does something more direct." "Who is the right authority?" he asked. "If half the Territorial Survey Commission is compromised." "Not the territory," she said. "Federal. There is a United States Marshal in Albuquerque named Garrison who has a reputation for actual independence. I looked into him when I was still in Santa Fe. He took on a federal land fraud case in Colorado and won it against considerable resistance. I think we go to him with copies of the documents." "I need to retrieve the originals first," she said. "They are not here." "They are in Albuquerque." He looked at her. "You kept originals in Albuquerque. In a safety deposit box at the First National Bank under the name Julia Ford. My married name is Yates. No one looking for the account under that name has found it." He breathed out slowly. "That is very clever." "I was terrified when I set it up," she admitted. "But yes, I was also careful." They made a plan. Julia would go to Albuquerque with Nelson to retrieve the documents from the bank, and they would request a meeting with Marshal Garrison. They would bring signed statements from the other landowners along the corridor, corroborating the pattern of targeted harassment. They would present everything and let the federal machinery work. The journey to Albuquerque was their first significant time alone together away from the ranch, 2 days by stage each way, and something about the motion and the distance loosened things that the fixed routine of the homestead had kept in place. On the first evening, stopped at a stage station for the night, they sat outside on a bench after supper watching the stars emerge one by one over the desert, and the silence between them was a different kind of silence than any they had shared before. It was spacious in a way that invited speaking. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "St. Louis. You said you had no family of note remaining. What happened?" A pause. "My father died when I was 16. We were not wealthy. My mother remarried a man who was not kind, and I left as soon as I was able. I came west because I had heard the West offered women somewhat more room to make their own way." "It does," he said. "In some ways." "In some ways," she agreed. "And in others it is exactly like everywhere else." He thought about that. "The man in Albuquerque you worked for. The dry goods merchant. Was he decent to work for?" "He was fair," she said. "He paid what he promised and did not make demands beyond the work itself. That is more than many." She looked sideways at him. "You are asking me to map my history. I am interested in your history." "Why?" The question was genuine, not deflecting. She actually wanted to know. "Because you are interesting," he said simply. "Because every time I think I understand the shape of you, there is another room." She was quiet for a long moment. The stars thickened overhead. "I used to think that was a disadvantage," she said. "That having multiple rooms was a kind of dishonesty, that people who were simpler were better. And now I think the rooms are how I survived," she said quietly. "Each one was built for a reason." He looked at her profile against the star-filled sky and said, very quietly, "I would like to see them, all of them, whenever you are ready to open the doors." She turned and looked at him, and the expression on her face was one he had not seen before, stripped of the accounting and the caution and the competence, just her, just the woman inside the armor, and it was the most beautiful thing he had seen in his life. She did not say anything. but she reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on the bench between them, and left it there, warm and deliberate, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat that way until the cold drove them inside, and everything was different after that. In Albuquerque, they were efficient and fast. Julia retrieved the document box from the First National Bank, a flat metal case with a lock that she opened with a key she carried in a small leather pouch inside her traveling bag. The documents were there, every page, exactly as she had described them, and looking at them, Nelson understood for the first time the full scope of what she had been carrying. It was not just a few letters and some falsified records. It was a complete documentation of a systematic fraud: names, dates, payment amounts, survey coordinates. It was the kind of evidence that cases were built on. Marshal Garrison's office was on a side street off the main avenue in Albuquerque, a plain building with a territorial flag and a federal seal on the door. The marshal himself was in his 50s, compact and calm, with the no-nonsense bearing of someone who had spent decades sorting true claims from false ones. He listened to Julia for 45 minutes without interruption, which in Nelson's experience was a sign of either rare patience or genuine attention. At the end of it, he looked at the documents she laid on his desk and was quiet for a long time. "How long have you had these?" he asked. 18 months, Julia said. "Why did you wait?" "I needed to know who to trust," she said. "I needed to be somewhere stable enough to reach out from, and she stopped. I needed to not be alone with it." Garrison looked at Nelson. "You know what this means for your land dispute." "I know that if the Calloway Company's acquisition campaign is built on fraudulently obtained survey information, the territorial court has grounds to void all proceedings based on that information," Nelson said, "including the title challenge against my property." "And the others along the corridor," Garrison said. "Yes." Garrison looked at the documents again. "I am going to need to send a courier to Denver and to Santa Fe simultaneously," he said. "This goes to the Federal Land Commission and to the U.S. Attorney for the territory. It will take time. Not forever, but time. Can you maintain your position until the court proceedings can be formally challenged?" "We have perhaps 4 months before the legal costs become critical," Nelson said. "Quill is our lawyer in Santa Fe." "I know Quill," Garrison said. "He is good. I will reach out to him through official channels." He extended his hand to Julia first, then to Nelson. "You did the right thing bringing this here," he said. "I am aware of what it cost." It had cost, Julia reflected on the stage ride home, a year and a half of fear and secrecy and careful survival, and one marriage entered under partially false pretenses to a man who had turned out to be, impossibly and without warning, exactly the kind of person she had decided long ago that she would not allow herself to need. On the second night of the return journey, staying at the same stage station where they had held hands under the stars, she told him the rest of it. Not the legal facts, but the personal ones. She told him about being 22 years old and ambitious and alone in Santa Fe. About the first time, she had seen the discrepancy in the survey records, and her hands had gone cold. About the 3 weeks she had spent building the courage to copy the documents, and the day she had walked out of the commission office for the last time, with everything she needed hidden in the lining of her traveling bag. She told him about the fear that had lived in her chest like a stone since then, about the way she had watched every stranger too carefully and trusted no one, and how exhausting that vigilance had become, how deeply, unexpectedly tired she was. He listened to all of it without moving. When she finished, he said, "You have been protecting everyone else, the other landowners, the integrity of federal land administration, the people the Calloway Company would have cheated next." "I was protecting myself," she said. "Also," he acknowledged, "but not only." She looked at him in the lamplight of the stage station room. "Nelson, I need to tell you something else." "All right." "I came to Santa Rosa because I needed to be invisible. That was true. But I chose your advertisement because of what you wrote, the way you wrote it. You said willingness to work required. You said genuine partnership. You said you wanted someone capable." Her voice was steadier than she felt. Every other advertisement I read was looking for a cook or a comfort or a decorative presence. Yours was looking for a person. And I was so tired of being invisible that something in me chose toward the one man who seemed to actually see that there was someone there to be seen. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he leaned forward and very gently, very deliberately, cupped her face in both hands, and she let him, and he said, "I see you, Julia Ford. I have seen you since the day you stepped off that stagecoach and asked me about the water depth before you said hello." She laughed, the real laugh, the unguarded one, and it broke something open in her chest that had been closed for a very long time. He kissed her then, softly, the way beginnings are rather than arrivals, and she kissed him back. And outside the stage station, the New Mexico desert breathed its vast, quiet breath under a wilderness of stars. They arrived back at the homestead in the last light of a Wednesday evening, and the ranch was exactly as they had left it, solid and real and familiar, but they were not exactly as they had left it, and the rooms that had been two were now, by mutual and wordless understanding, one. July moved through the homestead like warmth made visible. The kitchen garden was at its height, and Julia knew it intimately now, every row and corner, the way she had come to know the account books and the storage patterns and the rhythms of the horses and the particular sound the windmill made when the bearing needed oil. She knew this land with her hands, which was a different knowing than admiring it or valuing it or planning for it. It was the knowledge of work freely given and received. Nelson noticed her differently now too, which was not quite accurate because he had always noticed her with painful precision. But what was different was the absence of caution in his noticing. He watched her come in from the garden with dirt on her hands and hay in her hair, and thought she was the most beautiful and formidable person he had ever known, and he no longer had any particular reason to keep that thought to himself. She told him she loved him on a Tuesday morning in the kitchen when he was making coffee badly, and she came in and watched him for a moment and laughed and said, "You have been making coffee wrong since October, and I have been too careful to tell you." And he turned around and she said, very simply, still laughing, "I love you, Nelson." And the words sounded like something that had been true for a long time just now finding their tongue. He set the coffee down and crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and kissed her properly, with both arms around her and all the months of careful patience fully released, and she kissed him back with equal lack of restraint, and the coffee was cold by the time either of them thought about it again. August arrived with heat and progress. Marshal Garrison had moved faster than they had dared hope. The federal land fraud investigation opened formally in mid-July, and by August it had produced arrest warrants for 3 senior members of the Western Territorial Survey Commission, including Harlan Creek, Julia's former supervisor. The warrants were served quietly to avoid tipping off the Calloway Company's legal team before the formal court proceedings. Quill wrote with news that the title challenge against the Yates property had been suspended pending the federal investigation, which was as good as dismissed under the circumstances. The other landowners along the corridor received similar notifications. Gerald Spicer was no longer coming to the porch with offers. The Calloway Land Company, faced with the exposure of the fraudulent survey data underpinning their entire acquisition campaign, began a strategic retreat that was both rapid and ungraceful, canceling contracts, recalling their lawyers, publicly denying any knowledge of the commission fraud while privately negotiating with the U.S. Attorney's Office for whatever minimal damage they could contain. It was the retreat of an organization that had been caught, and the sight of it was deeply satisfying in a way that Nelson could not quite articulate without sounding vindictive, though he felt it was simply justice taking its proper shape. The other landowners gathered at the Yates homestead on a Saturday in late August, Tom Aldridge and Cecilia Moss and the Beauchamps and 3 others, and they sat on the covered porch in the evening heat and ate supper together, and talked about what had been saved. There was a spirit in the gathering that was quieter than celebration but more substantial, the particular feeling of people who have held a line together and know what it cost and are grateful without being triumphant. Cecilia Moss, who was 60 years old and had buried a husband and raised 3 children on her own and survived 2 droughts, looked at Julia across the table and said, "You did this. You should know that." Julia shook her head. "We did this. You had the courage to start it," Cecilia said. "That is its own thing." Nelson sat beside Julia and felt her shoulder against his and said nothing because nothing needed saying. He held her hand under the table and she squeezed his, and they looked at the gathered faces of the people whose land was still theirs, whose futures were still intact, and he understood something he had only half known before. The land was good. The land was real and hard-won, and worth every dollar and every hour he had put into it. But it was not the thing he had been fighting for. He had known that in the abstract for months, and he had said it to her on a September evening in the copper light, and she had cried. But sitting here now he knew it in the full and final way, not as a truth he had arrived at, but as a truth he was living in. September came in gold and copper, and the evening arrived when he had said those words to her, the evening that had been the height of everything before the telling of it. He had known by then what the Calloway Company was, and what was at stake, and what Julia was carrying. He had not known that she would stand on that porch and tell him to let the land go, and that the reason she was saying it would not be indifference but terror, the particular terror of someone who loves something and is afraid of what it will cost. He had seen it in her face. Not detachment, not pragmatism, fear. She was afraid for him. And so when she said the land was not worth fighting for, he had understood in the way that people understand true things that she was not speaking about acreage or water rights or deed challenges. She was saying, "You matter more than this. Do not die for this. I cannot lose you." And he had said, "I am not fighting for the land." And she had known exactly what he meant. Now, on the other side of everything, with the federal investigation settled and the Calloway Company dismantled, and the title to the Yates homestead clear and uncontested, and the other landowners holding their ground and Quill's final bill paid in full, and the kitchen garden put to bed for winter, and the second bedroom finally, permanently, no longer functioning as a bedroom. They sat together on the porch in the September evening and watched the same copper light that had witnessed all of it come to rest on the grassland. "What will you do with yourself?" Nelson asked, "now that you do not have a conspiracy to manage?" She leaned her head against his shoulder and said, "I have been thinking about that. And I have been writing," she said, "since spring, not records and not bookkeeping, something else." He looked at her surprised. "What kind of writing?" "An account," she said, "of the whole thing, the commission fraud, the land acquisition, the way it worked. How federal oversight of survey processes in the territories is essentially non-existent, and how that creates the conditions for exactly this kind of corruption to flourish." She paused. "There is a man in Albuquerque who runs the Journal, the same paper you placed your advertisement in. He is interested in publishing it." "As a news piece?" Nelson said. "As a series," she said. "Investigative over several weeks, with names and documents cited." She tilted her head up to look at him. "It will make the Calloway Company and certain named individuals within the territorial government extremely uncomfortable." He looked at her for a long moment and then he started laughing. Genuinely, fully, the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere deep and real. "Of course it will," he said. She smiled at him, that particular smile that he had learned was reserved for him alone, that had nothing of the public competence in it and everything of the real woman underneath. "Do you mind?" she asked. "Truly." "Mind?" He shook his head. "I think it is the most entirely you thing I have ever heard." She laughed too then, and pressed her face briefly into his shoulder, and he put his arm around her and held her close in the September evening, with the grassland breathing gold around them. In October, the first installment of Julia's series appeared in the Albuquerque Daily Journal under the byline Julia Ford Yates, and the reaction was immediate and loud in the way that true things stated plainly in public tend to be. The territorial governor's office issued a response that was simultaneously defensive and investigative, because the documented evidence left very little room for the former and demanded the latter. 3 members of the territorial legislature called for an independent review of the Survey Commission. A federal inspector arrived from Washington, D.C. in the second week of November. Marshal Garrison wrote a brief personal note to Julia that said only, "Well done. This is what it is supposed to look like." The series ran for 8 weeks, and by the end of it, the Western Territorial Survey Commission had been formally restructured under new federal oversight requirements, with mandatory public disclosure of all survey findings before any private acquisition proceedings could commence on affected properties. It was not everything. It was not the end of land fraud in New Mexico territory, because nothing was the end of that in 1882. But it was something real, something with teeth, something that would make the next Gerald Spicer work considerably harder for considerably less. Winter came to the Yates homestead in its usual way, and this time they met it together in every sense, no separate rooms and no careful distances, just the full warm reality of 2 people who had chosen each other in the most genuine way, through shared hardship and honest knowledge and the particular intimacy of having seen each other at their most tested. Nelson taught Julia more about the cattle in the winter months, the detailed work of ranching that she had observed from a distance but not yet entered fully, and she taught him several things about bookkeeping efficiency that genuinely improved the financial operations of the ranch. And they spent long evenings reading and playing cards and talking about everything and nothing, and the homestead was full of something that had not been there before. Something warm and alive that had very little to do with the fire in the hearth. In the spring of 1883, Julia told him she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen, practical and direct in her particular way, the same way she had told him everything that mattered, looking him in the eyes and saying the thing plainly. He looked at her for a moment, and then he came to her and held her for a long time without saying anything, and she felt his heart beating very fast against her ear. When he finally spoke, he said, "Are you all right? How are you feeling?" She pulled back and looked at him. "I am fine. I am healthy, and the spring work is manageable, and I intend to continue managing the accounts until about a week before the birth." He laughed quietly. "Of course you do. I do have one request," she said. "Anything. I would like to plant a larger kitchen garden this year, if we are feeding 3. He kissed her forehead. "We will plant the largest kitchen garden in the territory." Their son was born in November of 1883 on a cold, clear morning when the light came in hard and bright through the bedroom window, and Meredith Hollis was there, efficient and capable and deeply moved in the way she was moved by all the important things she witnessed. He was a strong and noisy baby with his mother's dark eyes and his father's hands, wide in the palm and square at the fingers, built for holding things. They named him James William Yates, after nobody in particular, because they felt he deserved a name that was entirely his own. Cecilia Moss came to visit in December and sat with the baby in her arms for a full hour with an expression of uncomplicated happiness on her face, while Julia and Nelson sat at the kitchen table with coffee and the Yates account books, which were in excellent order. "You should write about this too," Cecilia said, looking at the baby. Julia looked up from the ledger. "Write about what?" "About how land becomes home," Cecilia said. "About what it is actually worth, not in dollars." Julia looked at Nelson across the table, and he looked back at her, and between them passed the full and quiet knowledge of everything they had come through to be sitting in this kitchen on this cold December morning, with the windmill turning outside, and the grassland white with the first snow of winter, and their son asleep in the arms of a woman who had held her own land against the same forces that had tried to take theirs. "Maybe," Julia said, "when I have time." Nelson reached across the ledger and covered her hand with his. "You will have time," he said. "We have a great deal of time." She turned her hand over and held his. the same way she had on that stage station bench under the stars, warm and deliberate and completely real. The homestead stood on its 40 acres, solid and alive, the windmill turning, the barn red against the winter white, the well deep and the water clean, the kitchen garden resting under its snow blanket for the season ahead. It was not the most valuable land in New Mexico territory, even with the railroad built eventually on a different corridor 2 years later when the original route was compromised by the investigation. It was not famous or remarkable in any way that territorial records would note. It was 40 acres of good grassland southeast of Santa Rosa, with a house that had started as one room and grown, and a barn that was solid, and a well that had never gone dry. But in the winter of 1883, it was the place where James William Yates slept his first sleep, and where two people who had both come to the frontier alone, carrying their separate weights of loss and necessity and guarded hope, had found in each other something that neither of them had been looking for when they started, and both of them had needed all along. By the spring of 1885, the homestead had changed and grown in the way of places that are truly inhabited. Nelson had added a second full bedroom to accommodate their growing household, the framing solid and the adobe walls thick, and the window facing east so the morning light came in clean and warm. There was a proper porch now along the front of the house, not just the covered stoop, but a real porch with 2 chairs that they occupied on most evenings when the weather allowed, and a small table between the chairs where coffee cups and books and account ledgers accumulated in a comfortable, lived-in way. James had become a sturdy toddler of 18 months with strong opinions about horses, and an early and inconvenient habit of escaping any space he was placed in, which his parents had concluded he inherited from his mother's side. He could say perhaps 15 words with confidence, and several dozen more with creative approximation, and he regarded the ranch animals with an aristocratic familiarity that the horses and the cattle appeared to find charming. Julia had continued writing. After the journal series, the previous editor had asked her for 2 more investigative pieces on territorial land policy, which she wrote with the same meticulous documentation and clear prose, and they had run to similar effect. She had also, quietly in the evenings after the baby was asleep, begun work on the longer piece Cecilia Moss had suggested, the one about what land was actually worth. Not a legal argument, but a human one. About the Beauchamps and their market garden and what it meant to them. About Cecilia holding 300 acres through a decade of drought and pressure and loneliness. About a man from Kansas who had driven fence posts into unfamiliar earth and called it home. She had not told Nelson she was writing it, not yet, waiting until it was more fully formed, but he knew something was happening in the evenings because he could feel it in the quality of her presence, that particular attentiveness she got when she was turning something important over in her mind. He waited. He was a patient man. He had built 40 acres out of raw land through patience, and he had won a year-long land fraud battle through patience, and he had fallen in love slowly and completely, and forever with a woman who needed things to go at her own pace, and patience had never once failed him. One evening in April of 1885, she came out to the porch where he was sitting with his coffee and the account book and the particular contentment of a man whose life has turned out to be exactly sufficient, and she had pages in her hand. "I have been writing something," she said. He set down the account book. "I know." She sat in her chair. "You knew?" "I could tell." She looked at the pages and then at him. "I want to read you something, the beginning of it." "All right," he said. She looked at the first page and found her voice, the clear and careful voice she had when she was reading something she had worked over many times. "The most valuable property in New Mexico territory," she read, "is not the railroad corridor that the Calloway Land Company spent 3 years and enormous sums of fraudulent effort trying to acquire. It is not any of the 40-acre homesteads along that corridor, though each of them is priceless to the people who built them. It is not measured in acres or water rights or soil depth or proximity to rail lines. It is measured in what is planted and what grows, not in the ground but between people. What survives not drought but dishonesty. What is worth in the end the fight. She stopped reading and looked at him. He looked at the grassland in the April evening, gold and green and impossibly alive, and then looked at her. "Keep going," he said. She read him the rest of it, all the pages, while the evening came down around them soft and quiet, and James slept inside and the windmill turned in the last of the daylight. And when she finished, he said nothing for a moment and then said, "It is the best thing you have ever written." "Do you think so?" "I know so," he said. "The journal should publish it." "I was thinking the Santa Fe paper," she said. "Larger circulation in the territory, more of the people it concerns." He nodded. "Even better." She set the pages on the table between them and picked up her coffee and looked at the land in the last light with the same clear accounting expression she had worn the first day she stood in this yard. But the calculation now was different. Not measuring what was here against what she had expected. Measuring what was here against what it had cost, and finding it. The house and the garden and the windmill and the man beside her and the child sleeping inside. Not just sufficient, but abundant. "Nelson," she said, "yes, I am glad I came." He turned and looked at her, his quiet, steady look, the one she had needed 3 months to trust and had trusted completely ever since. "So am I," he said. "Every single day." A second child arrived in October of 1886, a girl this time, born on a clear autumn morning very similar to the one that had preceded her brother by 3 years. They named her Clara Rose Yates, and from her first days she was different from James in temperament as opposite poles are different, quiet and watchful where he was vigorous and loud, studying everything around her with large dark eyes that her father said looked exactly like her mother's, which Julia counted as the highest compliment. The piece Julia had written about land and value, and the human cost of the Calloway fraud had been published in the Santa Fe New Mexican in June of 1885, and had generated a response that continued in letters to the editor for 4 months afterward. It was reprinted in 2 other territorial papers. The federal land oversight reform that had begun with Marshall Garrison's investigation was cited in subsequent federal legislation regarding territorial land surveys, and Julia's documentation was referenced in the congressional record, which was something she found simultaneously gratifying and slightly surreal. She was also still keeping the Yates homestead accounts, which remained in excellent order. In the summer of 1887, on a hot July afternoon when the grassland shimmered and the children were napping, and the horses stood quiet in the shade of the barn, Nelson came in from the south pasture and found Julia at the kitchen table with a letter in front of her, and an expression on her face that he had not seen in 5 years, the old guarded expression, the one from before. He sat down across from her. "What is it?" She pushed the letter toward him without speaking. He picked it up and read it. It was from a lawyer in St. Louis. Her mother's husband, the man who had not been kind, had died the previous month. Her mother, who had apparently been in poor health for some time, was requesting that Julia come or at least write. The lawyer's language was careful and practical. There were no legal obligations, but there was a human question to be addressed. Nelson set the letter down and looked at her. "You do not have to go," he said. "I know," she said, "but you are thinking about it." She was quiet for a moment. "I left her there," she said. "I know why I left, and I know I had to leave, and I know she made choices that I could not save her from. But I left her there, and I have not written in 7 years. Do you want to write now?" She looked up at him, and in her eyes was all the complicated machinery of a woman who had learned to survive by staying in motion and who was now, for the first time in years, sitting still with something she had been moving away from. "I think I need to," she said. "Then we will write," he said, "together if you want, or you will write and I will be here when you do." She took a breath and let it out slowly. "Together," she said. "I think together." They wrote the letter that evening, the 2 of them at the kitchen table after supper with the lamp lit and the children asleep and the night insects outside. And it was one of the harder things she had done in a life that had contained considerable difficulty. But she did it. And it was honest, and it was kind where kindness was possible, and it left the door open by a careful inch for whatever her mother chose to do with it. Her mother wrote back in September, a short and somewhat formal letter that said more in what it did not say than in what it did. But it was a letter. It was a beginning. They corresponded through the fall and into the winter. And in the spring of 1888, Julia's mother came west to Santa Rosa for a visit of 2 weeks that was awkward in parts and warm in others, and better than either of them had prepared for. She stayed in the small room off the kitchen that had been the original storage space and was now used for guests, and she met James, who was 4 years old and immediately delighted by having a new person to talk at, and Clara, who studied her grandmother for 3 full days before deciding she could be trusted, which was a verdict the older woman seemed to find both amusing and moving. On the last evening of the visit, Julia's mother stood on the porch with her daughter and looked out at the homestead in the late light, the barn and the windmill and the grassland and the kitchen garden coming up green in the early spring, and she said, "You built a real life here." "Yes," Julia said. "I did not know if you could," her mother said quietly. "After everything, I did not know if either of us could." Julia looked at the land and then turned and looked back through the window at Nelson, sitting at the kitchen table with James climbing on his back, and Clara sitting on the table itself, examining a button, with intense concentration. She watched them for a moment, the 3 of them in the lamplight of the kitchen, the solid warmth of it, the realness. "We can," she said. "It takes longer than you expect, but we can." The years that followed were the years of the homestead in its full season, the richest and most ordinary stretch, the kind of time that does not make for dramatic telling but is the substance of everything that matters. The ranch grew by 8 acres purchased from a neighbor who moved east in 1889. The cattle operation expanded carefully and profitably under Nelson's steady management, and the reputation of Yates cattle in the Santa Rosa market became something that young ranchers in the area pointed to as an example of what patient and honest work produced. James started school in Santa Rosa in the fall of 1888 and immediately announced that he wanted to be a lawyer, which made his mother cover her mouth to hide her smile and made his father think seriously about law books he could order from Albuquerque. Clara followed 2 years behind him and was the more scholastic of the 2, reading ahead of her class from the beginning and conducting what amounted to scientific experiments on the kitchen garden in the summers with methodical records that her mother recognized and quietly treasured. By 1890, when the United States Census counted the Yates household as Nelson, 36, rancher, Julia, 33, writer and bookkeeper, James, 6, and Clara, 4, they were exactly what they appeared to be, a family in the fullest and most ordinary sense with all the depth and weather that the word contained. The homestead was solid and real. The windmill turned. The well was deep. The account books were current. On a September evening of 1890, exactly 8 years from the evening that had begun this whole accounting, the copper light came down over the grassland in the same way it had always done, changeless in the way of the land itself, and Nelson and Julia sat on the porch in their 2 chairs with their coffee cups, and the house sounds behind them of children doing what children did in the comfortable hour before bed. "I have been thinking about something," Julia said. "What is that?" "The original advertisement," she said. "The one in the journal you said seeks capable woman." "I did," he said. "You were advertising for a ranching partner," she said. "I was." "And you got one," she said, with the particular dry precision that had been making him laugh for 8 years. "And also significantly more complication than advertised." "Significantly more everything than advertised," he agreed. She turned and looked at him in the evening light, and it was the same face it had always been, clear and direct and more beautiful to him now than it had ever been in the early days when beauty was only a fact and not a history. "Do you have any regrets?" she asked. "About any of it?" He thought about it genuinely, the way she deserved to have genuine answers. He thought about the land dispute and the cost of the legal fight and the long months of pressure, and the nights lying awake calculating what they had and what it might cost to keep it. He thought about the secrets she had carried and the fear she had lived in, and the year it had taken for the full truth to be between them, unhidden. He thought about the survey documents and the federal investigation and the Calloway Company's defeat, and the other landowners whose land was still theirs because of what Julia had carried and what they had done with it together. He thought about the letter to her mother and the 2-week visit and the careful inch of open door. He thought about James announcing his intention to be a lawyer with the absolute certainty of a 6-year-old who does not yet know that certainty is a finite resource, and Clara examining her button at the kitchen table, and Meredith Holly's crying at the wedding over a jar of preserved peaches. He looked at Julia in the September light. "Not one," he said. She held his eyes for a moment, then nodded slowly, with the expression of someone who has had something confirmed that they already knew. "Good," she said. "Neither do I." She reached over and took his hand the way she always did, the same warm, deliberate gesture from that stage station bench under the stars, and he held it the way he always did, and they sat on the porch of the home they had built together and listened to the grassland breathe in the last light of the day. Inside, James called something to Clara, and Clara replied with the particular authority of a younger sibling who is also the smarter one. And Nelson and Julia looked at each other, and both of them smiled, and the windmill turned, and the night came on soft and full of stars, and the Yates homestead held its ground as it always had and always would, 48 acres of hard-won New Mexico earth, worth everything and more than everything, and that was the truth of it in all its rooms.